As Basra kindly said, I am a doctoral candidate at UC Santa Barbara with Vesna Wallace, and my field is in religious studies. Specifically, I look at Buddhism. I'm here in London, courtesy of a Council of American Overseas Research Center multi-country fellowship. And I'm hoping tonight, if it's all right, I'll talk a bit about myself, my interests, how I came to Mongolia, and also about my research. But I'm actually much more interested in what you have to say about sort of my topic. I'm very open, any advice you have, any comments, because, as I will explain, the nature of my work is it's a very sensitive topic, and so I do not pursue my research. I would use the word aggressively. I introduce myself, and then I sort of extend an invitation for people, if they're comfortable and willing, to then talk with me. This is because I study funerals. I look at my elevator pitch is that I look at the socioeconomic impact of cultural changes and economic development on traditional religious and cultural forms, practices, and identities. My working thesis is that funerals are a very effective lens through which to study this broader dynamic, because a funeral will show changes both on the cultural broad level and on the personal individual level across spheres of ecology, economy, sociology, interpersonal relations, questions of age and generation, questions of gender, and that all of these developments, which are all part of human society, which are always in flux, will show themselves in a funeral based on the choices that are made, the certain elements of ritual, the certain material culture that appears at the funeral, the texts that are read, the procedures that are followed. So that's my working thesis, that by looking at a funeral and the changes we see in funerals and around funerals, we can study broader patterns of change within a culture and a country. The reason I'm so interested in Mongolia is because my advisor, Vesna Wallace, was telling me about her very long, I call it a love affair with Mongolia. She just adores the country. She loves all Mongolians. And I was very fortunate to receive a fellowship to study in Mongolia 2 summers ago. And what struck me as so extraordinary is that there's so much happening in Mongolia now. And I'm sure many of you would agree, when you go back to visit, it's different every year. It's really extraordinary, and it's different sort of visually. When you drive in from the airport, you see new buildings that honestly 8 months ago just weren't there. I mean, it's just amazing, the economic boom. But we're also seeing changes linguistically, we're seeing changes in media, we're seeing international influence coming from many different countries. A lot of the attention in Mongolia within academia focuses a lot on geography and industry. So there's a lot of work being done on the impact, for example, of the mining industry boom and the effect this is having on nomadic life. And that's very interesting and that's very important. But for me, I'm more interested in looking at the impact of, for example, mining and all the things that come with it, international influence, more international dialogue, more money, and the good and the bad of that. I'm not saying it's all good, I'm not saying it's all bad, and how this is affecting, really on a very personal level, questions of Mongolian identity. So specifically with funerals, I'm very interested in the development of the MFA, the Mongolian Funeral Association. Some of you might know it as the Buyan Company, which is sort of the go-to place if you have to organize a funeral. After 1990, you now go to the Buyan Company, and how that arose as a capitalist, economically driven industry, whereas before, during communism, there was no specific business to organize this. So it was individually manufactured. People would go to government buildings to receive the death certificate, the stamp on the certificate, to receive, you know, the notification of where to bury the body. And that then the actual handling of the funeral was often done individually. It was done by family members, it was done by friends, and it didn't cost very much. And of course, if I'm saying something incorrect, please jump in. I'm not the expert, you are. And so now what's so interesting is that there's been a shift. There's been a shift financially. Now you pay for funerals through the Bouillon Company. There's been a shift in terms of the activity required. You no longer dig the grave yourself. And due to developments of population and growth within the city of Ulaanbaatar and urban growth, there's been a real shift in the exact material location of where the ground burials, where the bodies can go. Because the original city design did not accommodate, as I'm sure all of you know, the extraordinary population growth that we have in Ulaanbaatar. I was told, and I'm not sure if this is correct, because I haven't been able to find the source, that in 1940, the expectation was that the population of Ulaanbaatar would never be more than 50,000 people. And so the city was built, the roads were designed, the buildings were designed, and the location of graveyards were all designed to accommodate a population of 50,000 people. Now I'm sure, as all of you know, now Ulaanbaatar I think is 1.6 million, which is, I don't know the math, but 20 times higher than 50,000 people, much, much higher. So one of the things that this calls into play, this brings up, is this idea of urban development and population, and the impact this has on, for example, something as seemingly inconsequential as where we can allocate space, whether it's for apartments or for buildings or for government institutions or for shops, but also for graveyards. But then like dropping a rock in a pond, the outward impact that something like increased population can have on something as seemingly unrelated as personal funerary traditions. So specifically, I'm targeting my research in 3 key areas. I'm interested in the development and the change within a funeral industry that's happened in post-Soviet Mongolia. So in the last 25 years, we've seen a radical change in how just normal people, not monks, not lamas, if someone in their family dies, how they go about organizing a funeral. Now it costs money, that's a big one. You have more options in terms of how to handle the body. There are more monasteries in Ulaanbaatar for consulting, the Altan Hatsak, the golden chest. And you have the option of, for example, cremation, earth burial. The new cemetery company has 2 big, beautiful cemeteries in the east and west of the city. And they now have the option of mausoleums, which is where you take the body and instead of burying it underground, you would you would store it in what looks like a giant wall where the body actually pulls out and comes back in. And I found this, I was just at the cemetery this summer, and what's so interesting is that they had an American man who builds these mausoleums in the US. And I was talking with him, and I said, I've never heard of this. I've never seen this. Is this in America? Is this popular? And of course it was his company, so he's like, oh, it's very popular. Yeah, it's great. Big business, big business. And I just thought that was extremely interesting that there are now, the funeral industry in Mongolia there are so many options that are available. But the question becomes, who is this aimed at? Who's the target audience? Because in the new cemeteries that are built on the outside of the city, the starting price for just a plot of land is $5,000 US. So that's about 3,500 pounds. So that's a lot of money. And my question is, for just average people, are people buying these plots of lands? Because you could argue, if it's becoming more and more common, socially not just accepted, but really required, then financial investment. And then we might see changes in the funeral industry having an impact on changes on personal relationships with money. People might begin saving in advance of a person's death in order to pay for the funeral. Now in places like Europe and America, that's very common. Funerals are very expensive. You will see advertisements on television that say, you know, it pictures two actors and they're quite old and they're like, oh, I'm so worried when I die, my children won't be able to afford my funeral. And then it's selling an insurance policy specifically to cover the cost of a funeral. So in certain countries, this is totally normal, totally acceptable. In other countries, that commercial is very strange. It's considered unlucky, it's considered bad, it makes people uncomfortable. So the idea of talking about death before the death has happened, in Mongolia, many Mongolians I've spoken with have told me they don't like it. They think it's weird, it's unlucky, it might bring death. And then to go one step further and to actually begin planning for a death that hasn't happened, either your own or a friend, is even worse than just talking about it. But the idea that if funerals are becoming so expensive that people have to plan in advance to pay for them. For example, it's not uncommon in the US to start a savings account for your child's college education before the child is even born. Because universities in America are so expensive. My parents joke that when my mother and father got married, my sister and I, you know, we came 10 years later, yeah? But they got married and they opened a savings account for their retirement and they opened a savings account for our education. And we weren't even born yet. So, in some cultures, that's also considered inauspicious. You're planning for a life that doesn't exist yet. So now imagine doing that, except instead of for an unborn child, you're planning for the death of someone who's still alive. So you can see how this is really changing elements of Mongolian culture and identity and really sort of abstract ideas of questions of luck, what's lucky, what's unlucky, questions of good and bad behavior, like what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. So that's one of the things I look at, this question, basically the role of money and how money is changing the way people relate with funerals, with death, with questions of what's auspicious and what's inauspicious. But the other two things I look at, which is sort of a follow-off of this question, is I look at changing relationships with ideas around funerary traditions and the changes seen within the traditions themselves. So one of the questions that people ask me a lot, I get this a lot. When I tell people outside of Mongolia, oh, I study funerals and I'm working in Mongolia. Everyone's like, wow, that's so cool. What do Mongolians do when someone dies? And I say, well, there are lots of different things, you know. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, well, what did they used to do? Like, have funerals really changed a lot over the years? So this is a source of great debate with people when I talk with people, and I would love more insight into this for those of you who remember stories from your parents or your grandparents or where you grew up. It would be very helpful for me. When the communists came to Mongolia, earth burials were declared to be the only appropriate, legally sanctioned form of handling a dead body. Earth burials, so just taking the body, putting it in some form of box and putting it under the ground in appropriate allocated places around the city, were chosen because in Russia and other communist areas, these were considered to be a non-religious form of burial. Non-religious, so there was nothing to do with God or reincarnation, no lamas, no priests, no monks, no shamans. This was just a way of cleanly and safely and conveniently dealing with a dead body. But of course, what's so interesting about that is depending on the culture, putting a body under the ground can be considered very religious. For example, in the US and Europe, handling the body, putting the body under the ground in Jewish custom is the only way to handle the body because it's the only religiously sanctioned way of dealing with the body. And in the US and Europe, putting bodies under the ground is a very Christian thing to do. So what's so interesting interesting is you've got in the communist context, putting a body under the ground is considered non-religious. But in the European and the North American context, putting a body under the ground is considered extremely religious. So as we see the way cultures react to this now in the US and the UK, cremation is becoming very popular. In America, a lot of people I know, people my age, they talk about cremation and they say, well, if I die, I want to get cremated. And if I poke around and I say, well, why is that? You know, why do you feel that way? They often say because they are not religious. So now cremation is presented as an alternative in the US and the UK to a religious earth burial. So if you don't want to have a religious funeral, many people in the West will choose cremation because it's seen as a non-religious way of handling the body. It was conducted by monasteries, and it was largely only done for high-ranking lamas. And it was also outlawed during the 20th century. So now, cremation has come up again. A friend of mine was a monk at Ganden, and in 1998 he cremated his lama there, according to the traditional way of doing it, sacking the woods, doing it on monastic premises. But now we have the MFA, the Boyang company, has actually opened Mongolia's first post-Soviet crematorium. And the crematorium is very Western, you know, it's not, you don't use wood, you use gas and whatnot, and I've been inside it, it's, you know, and it's presented as a religious alternative, and yet it follows this tradition. It's cremation in Mongolia is at a very interesting place because it's occurring in a country where cremation very closely aligned with religious practice. But now, for example, cremation in Ulaanbaatar starts at about $700 US, or about 500 pounds. So now we're back to the economic impact. If you are wondering how to handle a body, do you choose the 3,500 pound option, or do you choose the 500 pound option? But then this brings up the question of how do you go about making that choice? So then we have the impact of the Alten Hartsack, or the golden chest. And what happens if you don't have the money to bury the body, but the Lama says you have to bury the body? Or what happens if your father was very strongly aligned with communist principles and said, I don't want to be cremated, I want to have the body buried, but the golden chest says, no, you have to cremate your father. So these are all questions that come up, and they come up because we're also in Mongolia, and as I'm sure many of you know, there's a generational shift that's happening. There's a resurgence of religious identity in Mongolia. Some of it is Buddhist, some of it is Mormon, you know, the Seventh-day Adventist. There's a big sort of Christian influence. Mm-hmm. And some of it is shamanic. There's a huge rise in bowl practices in the city and in the countryside. So a lot of sort of people my age, who would be children around the time that communism fell, have a very, you know, a lot of strong opinions and a lot of questions and a lot of changes in their own religious identity, which sometimes comes into conflict with the identity and the opinions of their parents. And the last thing I look at is not just the changes in what's happening with the funerals, but then how people feel about the funerals themselves. And this brings up the question of the tradition of leaving the body in the countryside to be consumed by wild animals. And I've spoken with many different people on this topic, and what I find so extraordinary is people sometimes have really strong reactions to this practice. Some people say, I was speaking with one woman who was a university student at the National University. She was 21 years old, and she said that she thought the entire practice, she used the word disgusting. She said it just seems really disgusting, like that's so barbaric, that's antiquated. And she looked at me and she said, don't you think it's disgusting? Like as a foreigner, don't you think it's weird? You know, and my response was, no, I don't think it's any weirder than any other way of handling the body. And then I've spoken with older people who really like the tradition, who say, no, this is a Mongolian tradition. This is the best way to handle the body. It's good for the animals. It's good for the countryside. It's how we dealt with my grandmother. And so many of the changes that we're seeing are not just in the customs themselves, but they're also in how people react to those customs. changing ideas of what's religious, what's not religious, of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and questions of the relationship with the body. You know, what things are gross, what things are not gross. And then lastly, following this idea of sort of the emotional response to funerary traditions, is this question of auspiciousness or luck. So the fact that we're sitting here and talking about this goes against some forms of Mongolian relationship with death. My topic is sensitive, of course, and so it's difficult for me, for example, to conduct interviews or to ask questions, because some people will say to me, you know, I don't even want to talk about that. Like, that's bad luck just to talk about it, or it's weird. Some people, I was speaking with Otto yesterday, and she was lovely, and she said to me, you know, when I first heard about the topic of your research, I thought it was really strange. And I thought, wow, she must be a really strange person, which is an understandable sort of train of thought. And of course, if you think that, you know, so be it. We're all a little strange, I think. So, but one of the questions that comes up is that, you know, we live in a world where in Ulaanbaatar, I am the only person I know who does not have a smartphone. I've got this little old phone, and it's a piece of junk, and I'm cheap, so I just paid 10,000 kubik for it, and I'm happy with it. Every person I know has like an amazing iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or something. So everyone's always online all the time, and they're texting and they're tweeting, and we live in a world that is so internationally communicative that what happens 10,000 miles away one day, within 5 minutes, is being read about and learned about and looked at in countries all over the world. And now that technology is so fast that we can send photos, we can send videos, we can send cartoons, language is no longer a barrier. And so there's an extraordinary impact due to social media, like things like Facebook and Twitter, and just technology in general, that is affecting the way people in all countries communicate with each other and identify. And so my argument is that a lot of this trickles down, because you've got, in some countries, speaking about death is totally normal. It's acceptable. You can talk about it over the dinner table. You can talk about it with your friends. I was just speaking to a Mongolian friend of mine and explaining about how my parents, ever since I was a little kid, would tell me about their will, which basically, you know, the document that says, if and when we die, here's what you need to do. And she was horrified. She said, they talked to you about that when you were a child? My God, you're going to have nightmares. Like, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. For me, it's I just grew up with it. It was just totally standard. And so in some countries, it's very bad to talk about death. In other countries, it's, you know, not good, but sort of necessary. And in some countries, it's totally normal. But then, of course, you've got the individual issue. I'm not, just because my parents were like, look at this, when we die, here's what you do, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't mean that all Americans are happy to talk about death all the time. And similarly, just because in many Mongolian traditions, talking about death is considered bad luck, that doesn't mean that no Mongolian is willing to talk about death. So we have to remember that culture is sort of an umbrella, but we're all individuals that live within it, and so everyone's different, and we all sort of react and interact differently. Obviously, I'm very comfortable talking about it because this is my research. But are there, I guess, so that's sort of my explaining what it is I do, where my interests lay, and hopefully trying to convince you that I'm not really weird, and that there's a logic behind my research topic. And then if you're happy to, I would just be very interested to ask questions and to answer questions, and then to just have more of a discussion rather than, you know, me keep talking.
Yep.
If anyone has questions or concerns, I mean, or corrections, please jump in and say, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I misunderstand something.
Season үед ямар байсан та бүгдийн гадаад бол тийм бүр юм байсан тийм. Тэгтээ тэр үед чи бас нөгөө алтан хайр цэгнээ лигдэг лам авчиж харагдсан юм шиг үлддэг 40 соногт баян үлддэг тийм байсан тийм. Even in communist period we had this, you know, being a monk and pray for that, and then we have to do good things for 49 days. But the way we do the ceremony is brutal, but we still keep kind of secretly, but everyone knows.
Yeah.
You have to go to monk and ask the altar.
Yeah.
That's even I'm a child grew up during communist period. I know that there's altar.
Yeah.
I have to go to monk and ask which day and how we're gonna do the actual funeral ceremony, and then we have to do good things for 49 days, don't kill animals and all sorts of things, and yeah. Yeah, you know the open funeral.
Open. Yes.
Wolf and vulture.
Yes.
Yeah. Was it? His father died 10 years ago, and he asked them this ceremony, we put in a open, they wrapped up in a white cloth and put the place he wanted to be put in, and then after 10 days disappeared. So also even it seems nowadays still they have these vulture customs as to.
And can I ask, did your family consult the Altenhauser?
Yes.
And they said it was okay, or?
Yes, they said, all my brothers, I have many brothers, 8 brothers and sisters. We discussed how to deal with the body, mother's body. And we agreed to my father's order. We organized funeral from Romania.
After Hartsin, postin,
did your father say why he wanted the open burial?
Yes, he had a very nice friend. He was buried in open area. He said around this area where his friend was buried, not buried,
placed
open, yes.
So he wanted to be next to his friends.
Yes.
Place, yeah.
And where in Mongolia was this?
It's in Eastern Mongolia.
Probably.
And my grandfather also ordered to place an open area, but we decided to build underground.
They're doing very strong communist period.
Өнгөрсөн ил тавьдаг байсан.
Ер нь монголчууд ирээд ил
тавьдаг байсан. Арайч төвдөр чигнэр ингээд жижиглээд.
Хатар төвдөр чинь Европ байсан биш.
And they
коммунист систем нэгтгэснээс хойш тэнэ Оросд шиг гацрах гэж шүү.
Тэгээд зайлшгүй тэнгэрт.
Тэнгэрт явдаг. Хурдан хаалга бол тэнгийг одоо хотын хаалсан одоо сайн хүн байсан.
Энэ газрын ухаан гэдэг чинь нөгөө газрын одоо боцорлж юм гэж бас тэгдэг. Аль болох хүндхгүй тэрдэг бас.
Another reason is just, not digging the ground, or often is also environmentally friendly way to.
If you place open, then use wolves, I think. As people say that the grape went to the heaven for its sin.
Yeah.
Actually, wolves are the main predators.
So you say there are different ways of offering vulture. Because you say sometimes you put on the white felt. The vulture can spot easily. So put the white felt and then put the body on top of it.
And I've heard someone was telling me about wrapping the body in white felt and then putting it in the countryside. Do you know about that?
Maybe that's the how
Yeah, yes.
his father,
Yes.
because he said it's wrapped up the white cloth. And
I think that was like 1920, before 1920.
That was the most common.
People doing that always after the communist system was gone. The communist system was like, which is like all the cultures and stuff. And then they push it up to people who are unemployed.
So how would you get the white felt?
This is from sheep wool.
Mm.
Sheep wool.
But what about, for example, in winter? If someone dies and you can't cut the wool of the sheep because it's too cold, so how do you get the felt when you need the felt for the body? Sorry?
It's already made.
It's already made.
Yeah, so either you have it home or you can, or someone will just, give it to you.
Okay. So it's
Just
not
for the
special
funeral.
felt for the funeral.
No.
It's
No.
felt you have
Stuff
in the house.
Yeah, until this business coming into the funeral activities, I think everyone just helping out each other and whatever they have got, they offer to other. Because I think that's funerals another way to helping out each other and understanding the situation. I think it also that way it helps to people connect more closely.
And also there's custom. The night before the funeral, the body is left in an extra bed, empty bed, overnight. Then next morning, the people participating in funeral ceremony, they ship the bed, then put on site. Then we take the body on some wheel, then bring it to the countryside. Tomato.
Instead of taking through the door, you shift the gear.
There is.
Ah.
Traditional, a long time. Telephone to the
That's the most respectful way,
hotel.
because it's not taken out to the door. Like that. I never heard of that.
Often funeral has also environmental advantage.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And
So
nice
what-
to feed
What
the
people
animals.
like to heaven, I mean, actually, flesh and the bones disappear, the bones, nothing remains there. If you put underground and mainly mouse,
Yeah.
mouse or rats, they eat the
Eventually decompose it. Yeah.
Can I ask just how does it feel to hear me talk about this? And please be honest. Are some of you like ooh or interesting, or does it make anyone uncomfortable, or I'm just curious the reaction to it.
Yes, it's quite unusual. I won't say.
It is unusual, actually.
Yeah, because I think I'm going to some library talking about death or something. Because if people say it's a bad sign, so I don't think. Yeah, I think it's quite unusual. But I think it's practical nowadays.
Yeah, but that announcement about your talk, they say people actually questions. I told you because it's near to house.
Really? Like it's bad, inauspicious.
Yeah, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After I had the interview with you, then I can understand. I explained them because it's, it's not that. It's just, it's affecting the social and other affected by or affected. So for me, it's fine.
Yeah, so it's like Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, only on this
Odd days.
But what's interesting is that the MFA, the Bouillon Company, offers funerary services all days. And on Tuesday and Thursday, they're discounted because people don't want to use them. But some people still do. So this is an interesting question. where Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are the most auspicious days, the best days. But if finances are a real concern, it becomes a question like of balancing, you know, like Monday's a better day, but I can't, you know, Tuesday's cheaper. And I'm very interested to see the data of how many funerals are conducted Monday, Wednesday, Friday when they're more expensive as opposed to Tuesday and Thursday when they're less expensive. Because perhaps there might be a connection, like a generational connection, where older people might say, Tuesday, Thursday, absolutely not. Younger people might say, save the money, Tuesday and Thursday is fine. But maybe not, you know. It might be younger people say, no, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it has to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And it's the older people who say, yeah, Tuesday, Thursday, it's no problem.
What do you think this price is just proposed by this Boyan is reasonable or not?
I mean, I think it's very expensive.
Yeah.
I think it's very expensive.
Yeah.
$5,000?
Yes, of course.
That's a lot of money.
What do you think? How to reduce this kind of cost?
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about the, I guess you would call it the corporate strategy of the Boyan company, is they're very savvy in terms of looking at the market. So that price is specific to the Boyan company is actually the name of the crematorium company. And it's all under this big umbrella of different companies called the Mongolian Funeral Association, the MFA. Within that, so they have companies that take care of the cars that carry the bodies, they have companies that take care of the building statues, building tombstones, building the caskets, but they also have what's called the New Cemetery Company. And the New Cemetery Company has built 2 big cemeteries on the east and west of Ulaanbaatar. When you drive through, I'm sure you've seen them. They're huge, they're really beautiful, they're really shiny. And when you go in, they have all these different sort of categories of graveyards. So they have some that just the tombstone is, you know, maybe this big, just coming out of the ground. You can barely see it. But then they have some, you know, where there's a statue and it's, you know, 12 feet in the air. And so there are many different options. The advertisement, if you go on the MFA website, which is just mfa.mn, although the website sometimes is up, sometimes it's down, so it depends. The New Cemetery Company advertises the fact that they mow the lawn, they cut the grass every week. They have someone who picks up trash all the time, and they will, on certain days, you know, give fresh flowers, not on every grave, but in certain parts of the graveyard. So this is what I would call like a luxury graveyard. It's the difference between buying a pair of shoes in just like Naranjol, you know, just whatever, you go and you buy your shoes, versus going to like Louis Vuitton and then the salesman comes out and it's like, oh, can I help you? What can I get you? Oh. So, but what the problem is not that there is the luxury option. Because I think when you're looking at selling a product, you will always have the cheapest version of the product and the most expensive version, whether you're looking at funerals, shoes, handbags, universities, there will always be a wide variety. But the problem is that specific to grave underground burials in Ulaanbaatar, there isn't the space to have affordable underground burials in the city because the government graveyards are all now within the Gare district because the population is growing so quickly that people are now, you know, they're living closer and closer to the graveyard. And so a couple of things are happening. You can still bury a body there for free. If you don't want to use the Boyan company, you can still go to a government office, get the certificate of death, and take the body because that land is still government land. But I have heard of people who live near there becoming very angry when they see someone bringing a body and saying, like, get out of here, you know, my house is right over there, I don't want this body. And then I've heard of people going into the graveyard and digging up the bodies. And there are photos now on the internet of one of the graveyards, and it is upsetting. You know, the graves have been opened, the bodies are exposed, and then of course you have so many dogs living in the city. Sometimes the dogs are biting the body. So it's uncomfortable for the people who bury the body. They say, I don't want that. You know, I don't want someone I love getting bitten by a dog. And it's uncomfortable for the people who live near there. You know, they don't want a dog coming around with like somebody's arm. I mean, that's terrible. So it's a difficult situation because in theory, there's a wide variety of price for where you could bury the body in the city. But in reality, there isn't. If you don't want to pay a lot of money for an earth burial, now in Ulaanbaatar, really the only option is cremation, or burying the body outside of Ulaanbaatar in the countryside, or going back, you know, if you're from the countryside, going back to your town, or leaving the body out. Now, what's interesting with that is that the Buyang company, the MFA, they offer services for earth burials, and they offer services for cremation. But they don't have any service for an open burial. So in 2000, they wrote a letter that they sent to all the monks in UB. They sent it to Dashuling, they sent it to Ganden, they sent it to all the monasteries, all of the monks, the lamas who read the *Uulzalt*, about I think 14. And in the letter they said, please stop recommending people to do an open burial when you read the *Uulzalt*. Now this is very interesting because that's a significant letter, because that means, first of all, you have a private company telling a monastery how they should interpret a religious text. I mean, that's a big deal to be doing that. Second of all, the monks, you know, whether they listened or not, there was no big scandal. I spoke with a few, and some of them said, yeah, I just ignored it, you know, whatever. Others said, sure, okay, but, you know. But there was this was not seen as a big, shocking event. But also what's interesting is that I have not heard from the people I've interviewed in the last 15 years of anyone who went to a lama and the lama specifically said, you need to do an open burial. I've heard of people who the person died and the family knew that's what my father or mother wanted, so they went to the lama and they said, is it okay if we do this? This is what she prefers. The lama says yes or no. But I've never heard of a family saying, we don't care, you do what you want, or even saying, no, we prefer earth burial, and the lama saying, actually no, you really should do an open burial. And that is unusual because often the lama will specifically say you cannot cremate, or you must cremate. You know, you cannot do an earth burial, or you must do an earth burial. So I don't think it's a coincidence that this letter was published about, 14 years ago, saying, please don't recommend open burials, and now they're much less common. In the letter, interestingly, the MFA wrote, we think open burials are bad because when people take the bodies, they don't take them far enough outside of the city. They only take them over, one mountain. And so this is in the letter. They said the wild dogs of the city will then go find the body and will bring back like a hand and into the streets of Mongolia, into the streets of UB. So obviously nobody likes that. Nobody wants to see somebody's hand lying in front of the Ishtogo, But the reality is, I have never spoken with anyone who said, yes, I remember in the 1990s, there were people's hands in the streets of Mongolia. I've never heard of that. I might be wrong, please correct me if you have, but no one's ever told me that. So it's very interesting that there is an overlap now between the economic interests of the MFA, because remember, they earn no money from an open air burial. So it makes sense for them financially to say don't do it, don't recommend it. But the monastic, the religious institution seems to be going along with it. And the people, the individuals also seem to be going along with it. I don't speak with many Mongolians, if they're willing to talk about this issue, who have really strong opinions about leaving the body out or not. So it's a very interesting question, because funerals are expensive. But Mongolia is a country where you have a tradition of a non-expensive funeral. And you have, I mean, UB is very big, but as you all know, drive for an hour and you've got, beautiful countryside. And it is, you would be able to leave, the body out. In the UK, you probably couldn't do that. Maybe, I don't know, Orkney Islands, I mean.
No way.
Yeah, no way, right? Like there'd be some hiker who'd be, just completely freak out. So it's very interesting that there's a definite connection that's very specific in this instance with handling the body and the economic cost of it. Because I think, and remember that $5,000, that's only for the land. So that doesn't include the cost of the car to carry the body. Now they do like the treatment of the body before it goes in the coffin, the cost of the coffin. It doesn't include any of that. That's only to reserve the land. It's very expensive, and that's the base price. That's not an expensive funeral plot. That's like basic.
When I put the announcement today's talk, one of my friends from Mongolia commented that one. But because these monopoly companies, doing all these funeral businesses, people who can't afford without price, they just put open it. I don't know how reliable comment is that, but I can ask him to meet you in the end, because he's a lecturer of the institute. So
oh, wonderful.
Yeah, he would say more.
Oh, wonderful. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so a lot of theories in economics basically say, it's like water. A river will not stop moving just because there's a rock in the middle. It just goes around the rock. And so if the tradition since 1930 has been, for the most part, earth burials, it's been very common. People maybe didn't like it, but they did it because they didn't want to get thrown in jail. But now suddenly earth burials become really expensive. So that's the rock. The cost of earth burials is so expensive. Obviously, it won't stop people from dying. And it's not going to stop people from having funerals. So maybe what we're going to see is that in order to go around the rock, there will be a big resurgence in open burials because it will be the financially accessible option for many people. But then what we're going to see is there will be like a social divide. The rich people have the earth burial. The poor people leave the body out. And that is going to really shift perceptions of what funerals look like. If earth burials become like luxury products, like when I grow up, I want a Louis Vuitton handbag and an earth burial, like that's really going to affect, I hope you don't mind my joke, it's a serious topic, so that will really affect kind of how we view, how we handle the body. And then what happens if you're that person, when I grow up, I want a Louis Vuitton handbag, and then you die. And then the Lama says, well, you can't, I don't care if your mom wants an earth burial, your mother has to be cremated. And then you and the kids are saying, oh, Mom does not want to be cremated. My mother must have an earth burial. She always had the best, diamond rings, fancy shoes. She has to have an earth burial. So now we're seeing changes in financial significance, really like economic identity and class, social standing, based on funerals. And then of course there's the emotional component. We love our family, people we love, we don't want to upset them. And so if it's considered poor and bad to leave the body out, well, if the Lama recommends it, you might feel really bad and say, well, now I'm in conflict. Do I obey my Lama and the religion, or do I obey respect for my family if it's considered in conflict? So it's, I mean, there are a lot of questions that come up. You know, the financial impact of this has a huge impact on sort of the politics and the dialogue that go into this decision.
Like, it's not like unlucky, but even though I'm really interested in your research because it's a like small change, small research, but it's exactly the Mongolian social problems and how is the dealing with this. Thing is though, yeah, I have a question. Maybe it's a ridiculous question, but do you feel like Mongolian people, if even when my relatives or someone die, and people think about the money or people think about the finance problem, and just maybe my feeling is like my father and my brother and also my brother, they die. And when this hard situation, I always think about like how manage and how deal with this weird situation being good, and you know, it's a, how do you feel Mongolian people's psychology, like when this weird situation they think about the money or they think about like, you know, well-being or, you know, something, another thing, like it's in except the money, you know.
Well, I mean, I am not an expert on Mongolian people, you know, you are, not me. So I think human beings, you know, this is one of the reasons why death is so complicated emotionally, and it also is so interesting sort of intellectually, because of course there is a strong emotional component when handling someone's death. If you know of a funeral of someone, that usually means you know that person. And so naturally you will have an emotional response, and it will probably be, you know, very heavy. Very rarely do we think, yes, he's dead. That doesn't happen very often. You know, usually it's a sad response. And there is a strong desire, I think, regardless of religious belief, culture, country, to show love and respect for the person who has died. And then depending on the beliefs and the religion and the tradition, that desire to show respect could also be a necessity. You know, if you don't perform certain rituals, the person will have trouble reincarnating. If you, for example, in Catholicism, if you don't have last rites with a priest, you do not go to heaven. I mean, that's a very scary threat, because in Catholicism, there is no reincarnation. Like, that's it. So if when you are dying, if you don't have a priest, you're in a lot of trouble. Or if you did not die appropriately, for example, if you commit suicide as a Catholic, you are not allowed to be buried in the Catholic ground, which means you also go to hell. So that's a very severe thing. So the role of the funeral is two things. It is for the person who has died to help their reincarnation, to help them go heaven or hell, to purify any karma. But it's also for the people who are living, to show love for your partner, your family, your parent, to show respect. And similarly for people who visit the funeral. This is why, you know, we dress in black. It's a tradition in so many cultures, and it's, you change what you're wearing as a respect for the person who has died and for the people who are suffering because of the death.
Okay, my question is like, I know, and sorry to interrupt. And thing is, you know, in this world situation, usually we don't think about the money. And thing is, that's the main reason why the funeral business is growing up in Mongolia. And I think the Boyan company is the part of sort of sovereign company. It's a joint company basically. So one hand is Ulaanbaatar City's council and also the private companies there. This board member is half and half. One half is from Ulaanbaatar City Council, one half is private companies. It's just, it's some sort of just very bad business and just.
Well, I think you could say that.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you bring up because one professor, I didn't ask her a question. She said, "Oh, the Boyan Company, they do really good work. What they do is really good." And I said, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" And for her, what she meant was it's very organized and it's very easy. Before, you as the individual had to go to the different offices and dig the grave. Now you don't have to do that. You go to the Boyan Company.
Yeah.
But I have spoken with other people who say, no, the Boyan Company does really bad work. Now, first of all, you don't handle the funeral. Some people really want to. They want to dig their own grave. So it makes them very uncomfortable to pay someone to do it. And the question of money. As you say, Mongolians don't think of money during this time. I think when the cost becomes really, really high, it's hard not to think of money. And that is an unfortunate reality. If the funeral is going to cost you 2 years' salary, how can you not think about that? And then, like you say, the psychology, that can cause a lot of guilt. It can cause a lot of guilt to think, I want to do this for the funeral. I want to do it because that's what my father would want. That's what the Lama says I should do. That's what I, as a Mongolian, think is a good thing to do. But I can't afford it, And of course, friends help, but it's not the same. For example, like you talk about giving the felt. If one person in a community dies every 10 years, okay, then everyone can pool in every 10 years with the money. But population is growing really high. If people are living in a city, the community might get bigger and bigger, and your close family and friend network, instead of maybe 20 people, might be like 300 people. So if you have really expensive funerals that are happening in your community every month, it does become a big problem. So I think it is very challenging, and I think it causes a lot of difficulty because, it's like I said in the beginning, those commercials that are on TV in the US, they're aimed at older people who don't want to be a burden for their children. The only people who are buying those insurance policies are people who are sitting there thinking, funerals are really expensive, and I would feel terrible if I died, and my kids are thinking, how do we deal with the funeral? So I think the next big business that's going to happen in Mongolia is you're going to start seeing insurance for funerals. So if anyone wants to start that company, make a lot of money. I'm serious, 20 years, that's going to be huge. So no, it is a good question because the question, the relationship with money, can sometimes people really don't like it. They think it's gross. They're like, that's inappropriate. We're dealing with a funeral. You shouldn't think about it. But there is a practical necessity,
Time in Mongolian style of funerals.
What is it?
Waste of time.
Waste of time?
It's like a lot of time. For instance, 2 years ago, my friend died in deep countryside. He's hectic. He died. Around 200 people gathered in his area, and 30 cars. They stay overnight there in neighbor girls or in his girls, and prepare for the next day. And they eat, prepare a lot of food there, all night, they eating or something, sleeping. And the next day, the whole day they spend for the funeral ceremony. They leave all the jobs there. The governors or some company members or helpers, they spend a lot of time for funeral. This is very usual. So in Ulaanbaatar city is also, I think so. Another issue is why the funeral costs so much. Geographic region. So tall wall is very narrow. It cannot accommodate a lot of people. The land costs is getting high and high. So funeral costs is increasing. The life costs and funeral costs.
Absolutely.
Yes. But death is of course an important part of the life. It should be considered as a nice thing, I think. For the sake. So, I don't mind to talk about funeral things, issues.
It's interesting you say the question of time, because when I went to the opening of a new graveyard in September, the manager was saying, he was explaining to me how the entire funerary process would work. And he kept talking about how it was very efficient. He was saying, you come in this door, and we already have the body, and then you sit, and then the lama comes in, and then you pray, and then you go to this room, and then we bring the body, and then the lama's there, and you pray again, and then you go outside, you pick the graveyard, we bring the body, and then you go in, you have a coffee, we put the grave in the ground, and then you come back, you sign your name here, you get, wash your hands with milk, and then you go home.
Yes.
And it's really like boom, 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 and it's interesting because it seems to be very different from in the countryside, taking, 2 days off work, spending the whole night, spending the whole day. I mean, I think the changes we're seeing in the city run parallel with other changes we're seeing. People who have big corporate jobs, they can't take 3 days off for a funeral. They're thinking, this is good. This company is really organized. I can go to work in the morning, funeral in the afternoon, go back, finish my work in the evening, and then I'm back on schedule. So that's another radical shift in the perception of how we handle the body, like questions of time,
Дээрнээс нөгөө хүмүүсээс сэтгэхүй байна те. Тийм хурдан ингээд өнгөрөх шууд гаргаж.
There are just small families who have no human resource to deal with the funeral. So this kind of service really appeals to them because it helps them to handle the funeral, as you said, effectively and efficiently. Because some families have very small number of people.
Absolutely.
So they don't have any time or they don't have any knowledge
Absolutely.
how to do it properly because funeral ceremony is also about the proper, service proper ceremony. Some people don't know how to do it.
Absolutely, and there's an example where the company offers the service and says, well, don't worry if you don't know, if you don't have a family monk who can come and do this for you, because we know the right way, and then you don't have to worry about what to do for the 49 days or saying the right prayers and thinking, how will my father be, because the company takes care of that. And like you say, the question, the size of the family, people who maybe come from the deep countryside, but they live in the city, and they can't afford to either have the funeral in the countryside, or their family in the countryside can't afford to come to UB. And as all of you know, I'm speaking to Mongolians in London, it's an international world. Many people live not just in the countryside or UB, they live all over the world. And so some people can fly back for funerals, others can't. Some people maybe can fly back to see the day of the funeral, but they can't fly back, a week ahead of time to help organize everything. So I am not surprised, let's put it this way, I'm not surprised that the Mongolian Funeral Association exists. I think it has evolved and sort of was created the way a lot of industry is being created in Mongolia. And like you say, the cost of funerals rising, well, it makes sense. The cost of living is rising. Apartments are, the cost of apartments. A friend of mine was looking for one and it was like $600,000. I was like, oh my God, that's so expensive. It is rising, I think, in relation to other changes within the city center. But I argue that unlike, for example, the cost of living or apartment living, the changes we're seeing economically in funerals are really have a much broader impact across many more aspects of Mongolian tradition, culture, religion, identity. Yeah.
So Mongolia got two expensive ceremonies. So wedding ceremony and the birth ceremony is very easy.
Yeah, very easy, right? It's free. My friends, you know, I'm at the age, everyone I know is getting married. So everyone's like, oh, it's so expensive. It's, I gotta get the ring, and then I gotta get the dress, and pay for the cake, and oh, it's so expensive, it's so expensive. And I just sort of, I say, oh, wait till you die, because that's more expensive.
Don't marry, don't die.
Don't exactly. Just be born and live forever. Celibate. That's the way to don't marry, don't die. No.
Yeah.
No.
Have you done lots of research in the countryside?
I was in the Gobi last summer, and then this summer I'm going to be a lot in the countryside. But if you have connections in the countryside, that would be, like I said, because my research is sensitive, I feel very uncomfortable just kind of, you know, barging in and asking personal questions about these issues. So I try and talk with as many people as possible, and then usually some people will open up and tell me either funerals they've been to, or will call me if they're in the city in Mongolia. They will call me and say, you know, I know someone who just died, and I spoke with the family, and they're welcome to come along. Obviously, I'm very polite with a funeral. I don't stand there with a video camera and like ask questions. Of course, I don't do that.
Ride a bicycle.
Ride a bicycle, have the TV, do an interview in front of it. No, there's none of that.
How do you feel?
Exactly. Tell me about your feelings while you're crying. No, I don't do that. Yeah, but again, yeah, the question in the countryside, that's very interesting too.
It's different in the countryside. It's still the
Yeah.
traditional way of
Absolutely.
living is still there. Yeah.
But the question comes up, for example, if a family lives in the countryside, traditional life, but maybe one of their children has gone to the city for university, which is very common, you know, they study, and let's say they work there. Then what happens if their parent in the countryside dies, and then it's the child who's responsible for organizing the funeral? So that's where you see there's this connection between changes that are happening in the urban center and then, you know, seemingly disconnected, peripheral, countryside nomadic life.
Yeah. Because usually the countryside community is really close to each other,
Right.
just some of
Handle
them will,
themselves, yeah.
until the child comes from city or So that's the way I've been and hope still is.
But then the child will probably listen to the advice of the aunt or of the uncle, you know, because they are older people, so their thoughts or proposals are also very important.
You met several monks who, you know, read the Altan thing, but can I just say something different what the book says, or because one of my friends joked said he wanted to ask the Khandan monks when they open the Altan you know, usually have to do some good things. He said, please tell them put the trees, you know, plant the trees. Then it will be, you know, economically, environmentally, instead of putting the, you know, there's solar. What's it called, solar? There's lots of solar there. Special.
Stupa.
Oh, the stupa, yeah.
So lots of people, you know, do this
Those
stupa
stupas.
for the
We should tree stupas.
instead of that you just plant the trees.
Absolutely.
10 trees.
Yeah.
That'll make everything good. So
Yeah.
he was jokingly saying maybe if that's possible, can you write a letter to the old monks?
Well, you know, the MFA wrote the letter to the monks
Yeah.
saying don't recommend open burials.
Don't recommend.
I don't have
to
the
them.
influence of the MFA, but maybe one day if I do, I'll please tell them to plant more trees.
Instead of putting
More
the-
stupas, yeah.
Instead of that, just plant trees.
Yeah. That's true. I think that's a good policy. We should all be planting more trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he was joking, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I'll ask. Yeah, right. They won't listen to me, but I'll ask.
Yeah, it's just kind of sad, all these commercialized and going that way. Because the funeral is the way people also, connect it back. Because they do everything and they're talking what's happened in the past, and then you dig the grave, go hole, and you do everything used to. Now it's just because I attended one or two funerals here. I was so surprised. People just coming to like a wedding, all dressed, and nobody's carrying their actual body. And there's a car coming in, putting it, and they just standing around, and priest saying something, and then just few speeches and few cries. Then you're not putting the actual body into the hole. People do that, and I was just, so what's your involvement? There's no physical, emotional, and that attachment. There isn't that attachment.
I mean, some people say funerals, similar to weddings, if you are not involved, so you're not getting married or you are not the dead person, it's like going to the theater. It's like a performance. You're in the audience. And because if you're not digging the ground or making the bowls or being actively carrying the body, actively performing, so you're in the play, you're in the audience, you stand and you watch.
Because if you do that, you're psychologically attached to the whole things in, your mind is working behind, unconsciously or consciously, and you still have that respect for other kind of. If you go just that ceremony, be buried there, go to work.
Yeah, right, like, alright, good time. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's sad, but seems now the Mongolian industry, funeral industry is going that way. Which is, I guess, that's...
Well, and what's interesting is then in countries where that style of funeral is pretty common, we're seeing now a change back to traditional forms. The UK actually is the world's leader in what's called green burials, which is taking a body and not touching it, so like not draining the blood so that it putting makeup on, making the body look like they're sleeping, just taking the body, putting it in a simple box, not these, fancy coffins lined in velvet, and simple box. Yeah, really, like nicer than my apartment, and then burying the body in the countryside. And so there's no chemicals, it's less money, and without the big ceremony, maybe not going to the church, maybe not hiring the priest or bringing the priest with you. So there's, that's how we're seeing sort of, you see this big, like, expensive economic performance, but then it's like a mushroom effect. People say, no, we don't like that anymore, and they go back to community-based, less expensive, very involved, people holding the body, touching the body, digging the grave themselves. These things tend to flip back on themselves. They expand to a certain point, and then they shrink back again. So what's interesting is whether we'll see that in Mongolia, if the expensive funerals will become standard and everybody does it, and then maybe in 50 years, it'll flip back. Or if we'll see a development where you have the expensive funerals doing well, but you also have more and more people choosing to do other forms, whether it's burying in the countryside, open air burials, cremating on their own. I mean, it'll be interesting to watch the development, the choices that people are making. Yeah.
How about in your country, if important person dies, for instance, honored person dies, so it's much more expensive in Mongolia.
Yeah.
All Ulaanbaatar cities sometimes they participate in funeral ceremonies, in some cases. How about in your country?
Sometimes. Well, I think it is very expensive, but it's paid for by the state.
Yes.
So I just heard this. American presidents, after they finish their presidency, they're given a black book, and it's empty. And inside they write how they want their funeral to be. And usually they bury under the ground. That's pretty standard. I don't know if they can cremate, to be honest, because I think people would want, because many people would go and visit, and I think people would want to know the body is in the ground. And then they write, like, do they want a performer? Who do they want to sing at the funeral? Which religious figure to lead the funeral? And so, and this black book, they have to fill out, and they describe it all themselves, and then the government pays for what they ask. But it's very interesting. There was an interview, I don't remember which president it was, maybe Bill Clinton, and he was saying how it was really strange. Like, he had the book on his desk, and he was like, well, you know, it's kind of weird to, like, you know, and he had to do it, and he had an assistant who was like, fill it out, you know, you gotta fill it out so we have it for when you die. And he didn't like it, you know, he's like, oh, I you know, I don't know, it's like organizing a really fancy party, but I'm not allowed to go to the party because I'll be dead, so it's like, it's no fun. And then I think with public figures, usually, it is paid for by the government, and there are elements of ceremony. For example, when Princess Diana died in the UK, her funeral, it was interesting because that was the first time there had been a royal member who was no longer a royal member because she had divorced. But she was so beloved by the British people that they had to have a big funeral procession because, you know, everyone in London came to see the body in the coffin be driven to Westminster, I think. I don't know where she was buried. And there's an example where that funeral probably ended up costing a lot of money, but not for the reasons you would think. You know, I remember watching it on TV when I was a kid. There were so many flowers, but most of that was brought from people who were, you know, grieving. But I'm sure the government had to think, they knew this would happen, and they had to pay a lot of money for security, you know, putting up fences. So I'm sure it ended up being very, very expensive, but not because maybe, you know, the way a funeral for like a normal person would be expensive if you have like extra cake or really expensive flowers versus simple flowers. So it is, I think, when public figures die, it is a very public performance.
I see. When an artist dies, how many people must be?
That's a good question. I think that really depends. Where I'm from in the U.S., I'm from New Hampshire in the Northeast, and we have a lot of well-known writers and poets and artists there. And usually, when someone like that dies, there is a big newspaper article, sort of telling all about their life. And then sometimes the funeral is open to the public, so it's in a church or somewhere else, and anyone's allowed to go. But interestingly, sometimes it's not. Sometimes the funeral is private. And I think this is because if it's not a government figure, then the family pays for it. And so the family may choose to make it public, but the family can also choose to keep it private. And then usually what happens, if it's a very, you know, beloved figure, is like with Princess Diana, you know, the gates outside the church, that's people will stand or they leave the flowers or, but it's, I mean, there are artists who become involved with the government, you know, if you, for example, being a poet laureate, Maya Angelou, who recently died, she was a poet laureate for the U.S. government, and she was really loved by many presidents. So her funeral in New York City was private, and I believe it was paid for by, you know, her estate or her family. But she, you know, she had the president come and speak. So, I mean, that's a good question, because, for example, if the president is going to show up, you have to pay a lot of money to pay for, like, security, and I don't know if she had enough, if her family had enough money to take care of the president. I mean, I assume not, in which case then the government would have to pay. So that's a good. What happens in Mongolia when say a famous artist dies?
Well, this government pays partially half.
Okay.
Then friends and family members, they contribute
Yeah.
money. So, for ordinary people, if they die, then also every participating person, they contribute money. They come to the family the day or 2 days before to the family contribute, give money, or some things. Everybody participating.
I think it's good, very well known common, people usually give
money. Yeah.
money. Yeah. Individual or friends, and what happens is £20, £50, it's just used
It's
for
good.
that.
Yeah, it's a good tradition.
Yeah, that's the tradition. I think it's still the tradition.
I think in the West, giving money for weddings is very common. You give a present or you give money. But I don't know. I don't think giving money for a funeral is very common.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, Mongolia is very common.
It's good. It's good. Yeah, it's very.
Yeah.
It's very important because that helps.
Financially.
It helps financially. And
If it dies, then nothing.
yeah.
And their friends and relatives and company members, they contribute money
Yeah.
That's
to
good.
make the ceremony.
It's very good. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Very interesting talk.